Welcome to another episode of the brand called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome a very senior and respected professional from Brussels, Belgium, Salma Refass. Salma, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ashutosh.
Salma is a researcher, an artist, and an educator. She's the founder of Yadra and the Radical Commons. So, Salma, my first question for you. Your training began in economics, a discipline often seen as technical and value neutral. What experiences pushed you to question that framing early on?
Thank you for the question. This is an excellent one. I'll start by saying that I'm a child of the 2008 economic and financial crisis. I was a student in economics at the
Hmm.
time of when it all happened, and then when we had the European fallout at the time, I was living in Spain.
Hmm.
So, as the world around us seemed to be falling apart, um, we were seeing that all these models, all these theories that we were learning in the classroom fell dramatically short
Hmm.
of explaining real world events. And so I think all of us as a generation got an inkling that something wasn't really working. And
Hmm.
then I continued into my graduate studies. I went into a master's in applied economics. And it's really there when I finally understood something that I had read about that the wonderful Pierre Bourdieu talks about, which is
Hmm.
that we're being taught something that's called a neoliberal doxa. So it's a
Right.
set of assumptions that are presented, like you said, as very technical, very value neutral, when in
Mm.
reality they're deeply, deeply ideological. So the efficiency of markets, that growth means prosperity, that individuals are highly rational utility maximizers, so
Mm.
on and so forth.
Mm.
And that's when, for me, it clicked. I was still very curious and I went on and studied, but I knew that it was a battle of ideologies, really.
Mm. Great response. Was there a specific moment or project where you realized that numbers alone could not explain social realities?
Oh, many.
Hmm.
There were a series of epiphanies throughout my studies and my career. And I want to start with the crisis again because as I was so immersed into numbers,
Hmm.
right? So all of this was happening around us. And this is something we're studying, we're reading about in the paper every day. So it was all numbers. It was GDP contracting and how many home foreclosures and how many layoffs and pensions suspended. But in real life, and especially when what we now call the sovereign debt crisis of Europe started, being in Madrid, I saw it firsthand. And down the street from where I lived, there was a group of homeless people that just kept on growing every single day and different faces. And it turned out when I spoke to them that they were all reliant on a homeless shelter that was two streets back. And the shelter was overflowing, that they had to take turns to eat and shower and sleep. And what it what it brought to the forefront for me was that when we talk about numbers, we're really talking about the human story. It was people losing their homes, people losing their livelihoods,
Yeah.
their dignity. And we're talking about a quote unquote first world advanced economy. And for the rest of my studies and the rest of my careers up until today, I keep seeing it happen, how numbers really tell one part of the story at
Hmm.
best. If not, they tell a different story. And
Absolutely.
this is what we have to be very careful when we talk about human lives and human experiences. So, all
Mm.
of the social sciences,
Mm.
where we can really make numbers tell us tell whatever we want them to tell,
Mm.
because it's all about what you measure, how you measure it, who you exclude, and what you exclude from those measurements.
Mm. Well
So
said.
this trust in numbers that we have, I think, is something we need to start moving away from.
Very, very interesting. You are critical of technocratic and extractive development models. What does extractive policy look like in practice?
It's a big word to say something very simple, which is that it's whenever citizens are treated as sources of data rather than
Mm,
political subject on whom these policies will have a very real impact, a physical, a mental impact.
mm,
So it's a way of extracting legitimacy information under the guise of participation. That's what it is, and we see it across the global south. So I've worked on in countries across all three continents, in Pacific Islands, and we see it all the time. Often it's done by consultants or intermediaries that act on behalf of an organization or of a ministry, a government agency, and it really it's an approach that filters everything that we learn from on the ground
mm,
through pre-existing frameworks
mm,
and reduces findings to recommendations that were really predetermined because they always match existing
mm,
priorities and they don't result in the kind of systemic change that we would want them to result in.
Well said. You founded Yadra to radically rethink how public policies are designed. What was broken in the system that made Yadra necessary?
A lot.
Okay, okay.
But I often talk about the policy process and development programs as one, because
Mm,
as you may know, in the Global South, they're often one and the same.
mm,
Um, but I would summarize it in, I think, 3 points.
mhm,
The first one is something, and this is not my phrase, it's something that Mariana Mazzucato coined called
mhm,
the consulting industrial complex.
mhm,
So we're seeing immense numbers, Ashutosh. It's really hard to just explain and for people that are not in these professional fields to understand just how many large consultancies, large organizations are involved in siphoning billions of dollars in public money and at the same time hollowing out state capacity.
yeah,
It's short-term contracts, it's rapid deliverables, and we can't be talking about any kind of change when
sure.
that's the setup that we're operating on.
Mm,
The second one was a very difficult realization for me personally, as well as professionally, is just how useless policy research had become.
mm,
Because instead of being a genuine step in the policy process,
mm,
it became this bureaucratic requirement. It was
mm,
one more box to tick in implementing whatever these governments or these organizations wanted to
mm,
implement. And again, we're talking about both the
yeah.
policy side as well as the development side. And the last one was all the talk around centering the process and centering decisions around citizens when that really was not the reality and still is not the reality.
Mm,
Um, uh, it made it the way we've set things up made it impossible for the process to be
mm,
genuinely centered around citizens. And so I got to a point personally where I had to act. You cannot, there are certain conclusions you get to in life
yeah.
that push you towards action. And
Mm,
so that's where Yadra was born. And the premise is very simple. It's saying that good policy requires a genuine shift of power over the process itself. And
mm,
same goes for development projects. If we want genuine impact, we need to shift the power over the process. Who
mm,
decides what success looks like? Who defines the problem, whose knowledge counts, so on and so forth.
mm. You are also deeply committed to accessible public knowledge. Why do you think complexity is often used as a gatekeeping tool?
Um, you you hit it right on the nail. It is the most powerful, I think, gatekeeping tool, and I think it does two things. On the one hand, it protects professional authority. It's a way of saying, "Oh no, only the professionals, only the experts can talk
Correct.
about these topics." It's an exclusion tool, um, and it makes the circle of people amongst whom these ideas are discussed ever smaller and ever
Mm,
tighter.
mm,
Um, and it's also, I think, a tool of political exclusion,
yeah.
because it ultimately depoliticizes your constituents, your population. It's when an idea is deemed too complex. If you think of, I don't know, fiscal policy, for example, if we go back to economics or tax policy, when you're talking about deadweight loss and optimal revenue maximization, it can seem daunting to the person
Yeah.
that's not versed
Mm,
in these terms, but ultimately they're very they can be made accessible, not simplified. I truly believe that most of us can hold a certain level of complexity in our minds. It's just about making it accessible.
correct.
And we're seeing movements, especially certain political movements, trying to do this, but
Mm,
it's still not the norm, unfortunately. And I think there's a level of intentionality still today around this gatekeeping.
mm. I've heard this so many times in boards. If they don't want to disclose too much, this is very complex, thereby
Absolutely.
implying that the other person is not intelligent enough to understand,
That's the bottom line. Absolutely.
isn't it? Okay, moving on. What inspired you to create public segment? And what gap are you trying to fill here?
Uh, okay, so Public Segment is a podcast that I created a couple years ago. We've
Mm,
paused it now, and we will be relaunching it as part of a much larger and ambitious platform called the
mm,
Radical Commons. We
yeah,
can talk about it,
yeah.
but the it stemmed from this realization when I considered doing my PhD about 10 years ago, that it's not a lack of knowledge that we have,
Mm,
it's access to that knowledge.
mm,
Again, trying
mm,
to break the gatekeeping.
mm,
It exists out there, how much excellent analyses exist. You really wonder if what we need today are more PhD students, or is it more people that will translate this information into something that's not jargon heavy, that's not
mm,
paywalled,
mm,
that's not structured around professional career growth, but rather, again, back to the citizens, back to the public engagement side. And so that's how it was born. It was the desire to be part of popular pedagogy,
yeah.
right? Like many traditions
Mm,
have done, and understanding that nothing will change if we don't open the conversation to a larger pool of individuals and educating them in the process so that these conversations can be more and more
mm, mm,
intellectually powerful.
yeah. And you just spoke about radical commons, so let's talk about that. You describe radical commons as an archive of radical knowledge. Why is imagination so central to political and other change?
Ah, it's deceptively simple.
Mm,
You can't build what you can't imagine.
correct.
It really, that's the starting point. And I think the current system we live under, this late stage capitalistic system, makes even imagining any alternative unimaginable. And again, this is not me saying it's something that Max Fisher talked about when he
Mm,
talked about capitalist realism,
mm,
this widespread sense that capitalism and this iteration of it is the only viable economic system, that there is no alternative. The most we could do, the most we could muster, is maybe some incremental changes that could make our lives a little bit better or
mm,
make the lives of the vast majority better.
mm,
But no, and that I highly disagree with that. I think that this is continually enforced through material conditions when Most people are in survival, working many jobs, with a level of precarity that is difficultly fathomable in 2026.
Mm,
And so the radical commons come to hopefully, because we're launching on June 20th, to create a space where the knowledge of alternatives, of alternative movements and
mm.
alternative forms of life, alternative forms of solidarity can be brought together, can be nourished, and where that conversation can happen.
Well said. How does dominant economic thinking limit our ability to imagine alternative futures?
It goes back to what we were saying earlier. I think it's really this idea that we've naturalized, against our will, um, assumptions that are very much ideological.
Hmm.
And when I say naturalized, I mean we've made them seem as if they're the natural order of things.
Mm,
So we can't. Can you imagine a life without markets,
mm.
and that markets have the ultimate power and that they're hyper
Yeah.
efficient, for
Mm,
instance?
mm.
Um, Most of us can't, because we don't think that markets are political when they're very
Correct.
much political.
Mm,
They're a political design. The way they're maintained is through state power, and there's nothing natural about them, or
mm,
at least the way we approach markets today.
mm.
And so um, it's a series again of the assumptions that I was talking about earlier, that we don't think there is an alternative, and we don't think there's a possibility of something after that. The
Mm,
fact that we've reduced in mainstream economic thinking
mm.
human behavior to rational utility maximization, and that's the only way a human can be, right? A
Mm,
human is constantly in this self-interested individual
mm.
calculating costs and benefits. I highly disagree with that.
Yeah.
What about reciprocity? What about solidarity? What about care? And humanity hasn't gotten where it is today
Mm,
without these things that are essential.
mm.
And we were made, I think, to forget about them through this naturalization, what I like to call naturalization of economic assumptions. And our only way forward, I think, is if we move away from that. And there's this
Mm,
quote from Haju Chang that I really like, and he says, "Economics is too important to leave in the hands of economists,"
mm.
and that's one of my goals in life, is to be able to bring that awareness and that literacy to the largest number, so that we can engage precisely in these
Absolutely.
conversations and start realizing that the way things have been made to look natural is
It's
not
not really.
true.
It's amazing. There's another aspect that I was fascinated with when I was reading about you and preparing for this conversation, and that is art. You describe art as a parallel mode of inquiry rather than illustration. What
Yeah.
does art allow you to explore that policy cannot?
Um, I really appreciate this question. I rarely get to talk about both sides of my life and my
Mm,
work. Um, Art is really a different mode of inquiry. It's in the sense that you get to explore facets of human life and humanity
mm,
that cannot fit into logic models or
mm,
indicators or this hierarchy of evidence. One thing I was really struck by when I got into this path in the social sciences and in economics is that numbers are considered to be the ultimate truth, right? We talked about it there. And so we built as humanity this like hierarchy of evidence, numbers, and objective measures are at
mm.
the top, but then the narrative, the stories,
Yeah.
the human experience, the anecdotal
Mm,
evidence is really not valued. And so art allows me to do that. It allows me to hold these contradictions. It allows me to explore the ambiguity, because we
mm.
are humans and our lives are extremely
Yeah.
complex. There's a lot that can't be said, that can't be explained,
Mm,
and logical modes of inquiry within the social sciences can
mm,
be ultimately quite constraining.
mm,
Uh, and art comes truly as a complement, as a different epistemology. That's why I like to call it a different mode of
Mm,
inquiry.
amazing. Well said. Time for two more questions for you, Salma.
Mhm.
In a world facing deep political and economic crises,
Mhm.
where do you see hope?
Uh, I see hope everywhere because I believe it is a duty for us to always remain hopeful,
Mm,
to agree that the state of affairs is very bleak,
mm,
but to always be hopeful. Doesn't mean optimistic, but hopeful because hope entails action. If we take action,
mm,
then we can build a future that's different. I
mm,
think since COVID, we've seen that humans have the capacity of coming together. We've seen at the time in 2020, 2021, these care networks pop up everywhere
yeah.
outside of the state,
Mm,
outside of formal institutions. We've seen food distributions and childcare co-ops and
mm,
rent strikes happen all over the world. And it's this alternative way of politicizing the questions that matter to
yeah.
us.
Yeah.
And that was an enormous source of hope. I would say with what's happened in Palestine, with all these struggles happening worldwide, I think hope also comes from the fact that a lot of us are now taking this bird's eye view, and we're seeing the linkages between all these crises. And so it
Mm,
becomes one big crisis instead
yeah.
of so many that we have to deal with,
Absolutely.
whether we're talking about indigenous rights, about ecological collapse,
Mm,
about capitalism really breaking bodies and breaking lives.
mm,
Ultimately, we're talking about one big crisis. And so
mm,
as we see it this way, we're all of a sudden empowered with tools to be able to act. There's less despair and more possibilities for action. And I would say hope comes from young people because I think
absolutely.
the world we're leaving behind is so crushing that they won't have any alternative than to do things differently.
Correct. Great response. And my last question for you, Salma. We spoke about the global south a few minutes back. And the global south is, of course, beginning to make its presence felt. And yet there are huge gaps and disparities within the global south. My
Mhm.
question is, what would a truly ethical model of international cooperation look like to you?
Um, it's one where we deal as equal,
Mhm.
um, and as simple as that sounds, 50, 60 years after the last countries have been decolonized, we're still not there yet. Um, it's a world, not just a model of cooperation, but it's a world in which we're able to talk about the elephants in the room,
Yeah,
which are how external debts are structured, how trade is ruled, what economic extractive relationships still exist and
yeah,
that continue to produce the inequality, the injustices that we're trying to fix through a cooperation, through these
yeah,
cooperation modes. And uh, the global south has been a net creditor to the global north for
correct,
decades.
correct.
And it is high time that we talk about this.
Absolutely.
But it's beyond the economics. It's when we talk about knowledge, knowledge sovereignty, we have our own knowledge. We have our way of doing things. We don't have to constantly be playing catch up to to the north. It's time that our inheritance and our modes of understanding the world become as valued as those of the North. But it's also things like democratic control over global institutions. And here talking about the usual culprits, the IMF and
Exactly.
the World Bank and the WTO, it has to be democratically led.
Correct.
And so the global South gets a voice as much as the global North. And it's, I think, ultimately, as I said at the beginning, about being equals, dealing as equals, and being mutually accountable to one another, instead of saying there's one way of doing things, accepting there's a pluriversality, supporting that knowledge comes in different form, that we can build societies that look different, economies that look different, but ultimately we should all be working towards the same future.
Absolutely. And on that note, I just want to say, Salma, what an amazing conversation this has been. I think I completely understand and agree with everything that you said in your last point about the global south. I'm a firm believer eh, that there is need for the global south now to be heard, because there is so much value that every single nation in the global south has, and they don't necessarily, or we don't necessarily, have to depend at all on what the
Absolutely.
global north seems to say is only the way to do things. Thank you for
Absolutely.
speaking to me. I'll
Thank
keep
you,
following you
Ashutosh.
for your Radical Commons podcast. Good luck with your launch on the 20th of June.
Thank you.
All the best. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Ashutosh.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the brand called You.